Hello, everyone. I'm talking from home at around the time when we would normally have been starting our excavation season up at Sedgeford. And I'm talking really because colleagues today, when we met as the Sharp Committee, suggested that it might be quite useful to try and give folks who are Sharpies, who've been to Sharp in the past, who are hoping to be there this year, who are perhaps thinking about coming next year when we will be back in the field, I'm sure. Folks on the committee thought it might be useful for me as the founder director and the excavation director to give a kind of overview of where I think we are and where I think we're going. In the year when we were going to be celebrating our 25th anniversary, which we're sort of postponing most of the celebration, I think, to next year now. But 25 years is a very long time to be in the field and a good time actually to take stock. So let me just make a few general comments about where I think we've got to with the Sedgeford project and where I think we might be going in the future. Going right back to the very beginning, going right back to 1996 when we started the project, we imagined it was going to be a multidisciplinary investigation of the landscape, but also a multi-period investigation of the landscape of the parishes of Sedgeford. And we've certainly done a certain amount of work on other periods, but our main focus has turned out to be and remains, and I think will remain for the foreseeable future, the Middle Anglo-Saxon period. And there are very particular reasons why that is the case. And it's been because as the project has evolved over a quarter of a century, we've had a growing number of indications that we are dealing with something of huge significance at Sedgeford in relation to the Middle Anglo-Saxon period. I think the first clue came fairly early on in the project when we started our first major open area excavation on the site of what we had been led to believe was a Saxo-Norman cemetery. In other words, a cemetery of the 10th, 11th, 12th century. And it became clear at a fairly early stage that it wasn't that it was actually a Middle Anglo-Saxon cemetery, a cemetery which we can date from sometime in probably the later 7th century AD, then running through the 8th century into the 9th century AD, and being a large Middle Anglo-Saxon cemetery of much more significance, really, than it would have been had it been a later medieval cemetery. And the fact that at this time we had a very large and well-ordered cemetery, we don't know exactly how many people there were in the cemetery altogether, even now, because we're not absolutely certain about the full extent of it. Ballpark estimates anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 interments, inhumations, altogether, representing a sizable population, perhaps a population of around 50 people, putting burials into the ground over a period of perhaps 200, 250 years would give us that kind of size of cemetery. And also a very well ordered cemetery, with the burials being laid out in lines oriented broadly east-west and with no real grave goods, which implies, of course, a Christian rite. So the first clue that something really quite significant was happening at Sedgeford was the fact that we had this cemetery appearing in the landscape, appearing to be organized by some kind of Christian ecclesiastical authority. And it didn't seem to have evolved out of an earlier cemetery, so there seemed to be a kind of break with earlier Anglo-Saxon activity at Sedgeford. That's the first clue that Sedgeford is quite significant. The second clue comes with the realization that although we thought we were working really on what was also a settlement site originally, we certainly had what appeared to be sort of scruffy settlement type features. We subsequently discovered, as a result of field walking and metal detecting and then geophysical survey, that we had a highly organized, much more substantial settlement focus immediately to the south, a little bit up the hill, a little bit up the slope, over the track, on the other side of the track that we all use when we're going to and from the site. That's where the main focus of the settlement was. And as the geophysics showed, and as our excavations subsequently confirmed in phase 2 of the project, when we were focused on the settlement excavation, it was clear that we had a highly organized settlement to match that highly organized cemetery, a settlement which latterly, at any rate, was laid out in the form of a regular grid with roughly square plots bounded by ditches, and one assumes originally by little mounds, possibly with a palisade on or a fence on or whatever, but regular plots laid out in a kind of grid pattern with their hall type structures inside each one. And at a later stage in the development of that settlement, this huge, great D-shaped enclosure with its sort of monumental size ditch, which we interpret as some kind of high status, some sort of lordly enclosure. Now, again, when we became aware of just how well organized the settlement was, how extensive it was, and so on, we realized that we were dealing with something quite significant, in that this, just like the cemetery, appears quite suddenly in the landscape. The settlement also appears quite suddenly in the landscape. It doesn't appear to be a development out of early Anglo-Saxon settlements. It appears to be something relatively de novo, relatively new, a new kind of more highly nucleated, more ordered, more organized settlement being imposed on the landscape. And then in the third phase of the project, and again it was geophysical survey that was giving us the indication that it was there. In the third phase of the project, which is still ongoing, we have been investigating what turns out to be a Middle Anglo-Saxon malting complex, a very large malting complex, possibly several malt houses side by side. Nothing like this has ever been seen in Anglo-Saxon archaeology, or even, as far as we're aware, contemporary continental archaeology. This is an extraordinary discovery, which is indicating that there is a high measure of monoculture, in other words, mass production of the raw material that's necessary to feed into this malting complex, mass production of grain, probably hundreds of acres of grain actually feeding into the malting complex. And this is not just an industrial scale specialization in a particular agricultural commodity and then an industrial scale processing of it, but the implication is that malt is being produced on a scale, which means that there is a wider distribution network. So there is, the implication now is that Sedgeford is connected to other parts of the Middle Anglo-Saxon world, that we're no longer looking at a settlement of subsistence farmers, even a large settlement of subsistence farmers. We're looking at people who probably are subsistence farmers, but they're also people who are specializing in the production of particular crops, which are then being distributed on a much wider scale following their processing in the malting complex. Now, this is a completely different world from the world which is implied in the early Anglo-Saxon period, where you have relatively small settlements. The settlements are they're generally speaking unbounded. You don't have defences around them. You don't have ditches around them. They're probably little more than a hamlet. There's little evidence of social differentiation. They're scattered across the landscape, or probably, although we haven't found them yet, there are probably several in Sedgeford. This is a world where people are suddenly being concentrated in much larger villages, presumably because their labour is being organised. Their labour is being organised so that there can perhaps be the use of the heavy plough, which is a very expensive piece of kit, and you need a team of oxen to pull your heavy plough, and you also need to reorganize your fields so the fields are much bigger. You need a larger labor force, you need a pooling of resources, you need bigger fields being worked collectively by a larger community of people if you're going to go in for something different from subsistence farming for each family. You're going to go in for something where you are specializing, you're producing crops on a large scale, you're moving into an industrial scale of food processing, and you're distributing out to a wider landscape, presumably with other things coming into the community that you are no longer producing yourself. It's that kind of scale of activity that is implied, and we assume that that can be fitted into a framework of the emergence of the Kingdom of East Anglia, the growing power and influence and control of the Christian church, the emergence of lordship, secular lordship and ecclesiastical lordship, perhaps the division of the landscape into great estates, certainly distribution networks which are extending out way beyond the limits of the modern day parish of Sedgeford, therefore a much more connected world than existed before. All part of a series of economic transformations, social transformations, political transformations, an agricultural revolution at the heart of those processes, and in a sense giving rise to what becomes the medieval, the basic form of the medieval English landscape. It's all happening in a relatively restricted period of time, from the late 7th through to into the 9th century, the long 8th century we sometimes talk about, which is the term we sometimes use to describe this. And it seems that at Sedgeford we have this extraordinary microcosm of this process represented. Now, 3 clues that all of this is going on, and now there's a 4th one emerging as a result of the survey work that is being done by our historians and by our geophysicists. And this is, if you like, is my 4th clue that something very significant indeed is happening. A lot of our work now is pointing to a massive remodeling of the water systems that are feeding down the slopes of Sedgeford, feeding down into the river valley, feeding into the river itself. Huge amounts of work being put into controlling that water, using that water, channeling that water, organizing the way in which that water is moving down the slopes and then through the river valley, in order to provide a range of resources, in order to provide power for water mills, in order to provide a way of transporting goods in bulk. How are they getting that grain out? They're almost certainly getting that grain out down a reused Roman canal, reconfigured and brought back into use in the Anglo-Saxon period. That's what it's beginning to look like. They're using the water as well to power the mills, and resources, of course, are being generated in the water, which are being exploited, the fish and the waterfowl and so on, all contributing to the subsistence of the local community. In other words, we've got hydraulic engineering, which is on a Roman scale, which is being represented as well at Sedgeford. And this is our 4th indication from the archaeology that we're dealing with quite an extraordinary transformation of the landscape, nothing less than an agricultural revolution. Now, I say all this just to give a kind of summation of where I think we are, why I think Sedgeford has emerged as an extremely important site in the understanding of the Middle Anglo-Saxon agricultural revolution, and in a sense the creation of the landscape of medieval England, and to make the point there is huge amounts more still to be done. We have not completed the investigation of the malting complex. I think we've probably got several years to go in the investigation of the malting complex, and we hope to tease out a much fuller understanding of the technology and the scale of this particular complex. That's one thing we want to do. We have much more work to do, survey work, but also targeted excavation to develop our understanding of the way in which the Middle Anglo-Saxons were using water and managing water in order to provide themselves with the resources, with the power and so on that they needed. We need to do that. And I can see that stretching ahead many, many years into the future. I don't want to predict too far ahead, because it's in the nature of archaeology that the archaeology is, to a degree, the direction you go in is shaped by what you discover, what new questions come up. But I can see that that is going to keep us, this investigation of the Middle Anglo-Saxon agricultural revolution at Sedgeford is going to keep us very busy for many years to come. And therefore, I would, if you're watching this and you're thinking, where am I going to be digging next year? Let me assure you, there's going to be first-class archaeology. There are going to be massive opportunities to do survey work, to do historical research, to work on artifacts, to get into the trench and excavate if that's what you want to do. Lots of first-class archaeology, and all tied together by this framework that we've got of trying to understand the Middle Anglo-Saxon agricultural revolution as it is represented at Sedgeford. So there's a few teasers towards the next season. The last thing I'm going to say is just to make this point. We had actually scheduled an academic conference for November of this year. We've got an excellent group of speakers lined up to speak. That was obviously going to be a face-to-face conference in a conference centre. What we have decided to do is to try and run that conference as an online conference, and we're going to be putting up details on the website very soon about how we are going to do that. So we hope lots of people listening to this video will want to tune in to that conference, which should set people up very well, really, with the ideas, the background that they will need to make good sense of their contribution to the project going forwards in 2021, when I hope to see lots of you in Boneyard Field in Sedgeford. That'll do for now.